All right, so this is just a review of the student movement. So, what was the 1950s background that led up to this? So, you have new pop and film heroes like Elvis Presley, James Dean, and they promoted a rebellious attitude. And many parents they were shocked by these role models for teenagers. Then we have the beatnik poets like Allen Ginsberg, and they protested against what they saw as the smug life of middle class Americans living um, in their suburban homes, which all looked alike, all watching the same thing. And so Ginsburg suggests that people drop out, that they take drugs, etc. And there was a generation gap between um, the people who were going to be born, the baby boom generation, and then the generation that had fought in the Second World War. So this older generation, this is the parents, the teachers, and the politicians, they can remember because they lived through the hardships of the Depression in World War II. And these teenagers are actually brought up in a completely different America because America in the 1950s is very prosperous. And then many students, they turned against their parents' comfortable lifestyles and in their Leavittville communities, and they because they thought they were boring and that there was too much emphasis placed on money and buying things, and so they rebel, and so they turn to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and these things really shock the older generation. So, what were the reasons for the students' protest movements? Well, the attitudes of the 50s had carried over into the 60s, and they were often described as the swinging 60s. So you've got these young people that want more freedom in everything, from music, the clothing, the social life, the expectations, everything. And then one of the things that makes these things possible is the contraceptive pill. It allows women more freedom over their sexual behavior, and it lets them choose when they want to have children, which that has never really been done prior to the 60s in a way that was so convenient, anyways. And then recreational drug use becomes available. I mean, marijuana is everywhere, and then LSD comes out, and that's acid, and then there's heroin and all kinds of things that are people are experimenting with. And then we have singers like Bob Dylan. They become really popular during this time, and the reason why is because of their songwriting, which is protests against the war in Vietnam or just war in general, and then racism as well. So more and more young people are better off, and so they can actually go to college. So like their moms and mom's probably staying home, but like dad has probably got a job. Say he's working for UAW, he can now send his son or daughter off to college, something that he couldn't have done. For one thing, he was fighting World War II probably, but this changes things. It changes the trajectory of a whole group of people in America, the middle class. Then you have Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Campaign, which is being broadcast and is on the news every night in people's homes, and it's showing students how to protest. So it was often students who took part in demonstrations because they're not at work, right? There's a whole children's campaign that's part of the civil rights movement. But they did sit-ins, they did freedom rides, they did nonviolent protests to affect change, and it takes time, but it did work. Then we have the Vietnam War, which is going on, and it angered a lot of young people in America because they did not believe that the war was a just war. Like people did look at the war in, say, World War II against the Nazis or Imperial Japan, and they saw that as a just war. This was a group of people who were oppressive and who had attacked in an unprovoked way, and that they needed to be dealt with. The people in the United States, I mean, they hadn't been attacked by the Vietnamese, and many people couldn't even have told you where Vietnam was, let alone why they should send their daughter, or it's not their daughter, but their son over there to fight. So, and then the media, the news media, is showing the American atrocities that are being inflicted on the Vietnamese people. They're showing them the carpet bombings, the flamethrowers, setting villages on fire. I mean, a lot of bad things happened in Vietnam. So how did the students protest? Well, it's important to remember that the student movement, it's this broad-ranging movement. It's not like a singular thing. And not all students thought and did the same things, but some of the people and ideas that were involved would include like the Students for Democratic Society. This was set up by Tom Hayden to give students a greater say in the ways that the universities themselves were run. And they also wanted to help poor people and to protest against the Vietnam War, which they saw as being unjust. So a lot of students actually joined the Civil Rights Campaign when it happened, and then they'll transition to the student protest movements as well. There's a lot of anti-Vietnam War protests. There's people who, they don't want to go fight. They want to pull the men that are over there out of there, things like that. These were probably the biggest and the most important protests that were organized by students. So, for example, in 1969, 700,000 people marched in Washington against the war in Vietnam. This is a huge deal because this is These are civilians going to a place of political power and in massive numbers displaying their dislike with the decisions that policymakers were making. They burned the draft cards. These are cards that were sent to people ordering them to go fight in the war in Vietnam. And then sometimes they would even burn the American flag. And now, you might not agree with that, but it is seen as protected political speech by the First Amendment. Often there's going to be clashes between the students and the police, and the worst of these took place at Kent State University. That is the worst focal point of the student protests, and it happens in 1970. And we have 4 students who are shot by the police in a peaceful protest, and Americans are horrified. And as a result of this, a week later, 2 million students will go on protest across the country. So some students are going to actually become even more radicalized because of what's going on at places like Kent State, and they will begin to use violence. We would call these people terrorists today. One group is called the Weathermen, and they actually bombed Army recruitment centers and government buildings, often at night, but sometimes people were injured during the day. So they were definitely destroying buildings, okay, setting them on fire, things like that. You can't destroy government property. That's actually a crime. Other people, though, they joined the hippie movement and they decided to just drop out of society altogether, and they grew their hair long. They wore distinctive clothing, which is bell bottoms, lots of like beads and things like that. They traveled around the country in like VW buses and minivans. They would wear flowers in their hair as a symbol of peace. Their slogans was "Make love, not war," and they refused to get a job and work, but somehow they were able to afford drugs, which frightened a lot of older people because they're not doing these drugs like in private places. Like in San Francisco, there's like at Hyde Park, I mean, people are stoned. There's like, you can't walk by, a quarter mile of Hyde Park without being able to smell the stench of marijuana burning. So why was the student movement so important? Well, probably the longest lasting achievement of the student movement were its changes to youth culture, because it's actually going to be taken seriously. Teenagers are going to become aware of their individuality, that they're not just their parents' kids, that they have their own wants, needs, desires, and such. So, for example, they became more fashion conscious, and they moved away from the older generation. And the clearest example of this in the 1960s for girls was their wearing of the miniskirt. So that would have never been something that would have been allowed in previous generations. And I mean, these skirts are short. So the student protests, they helped to change government policy on Vietnam. Will actually eventually pull out of Vietnam, and they made a withdrawal from Vietnam more likely. One of the reasons why is because there will be an amendment which makes the voting age 18, and so this is going to put political pressure, or it was expected that it was going to put political pressure on the government. It didn't actually do that, but they provided lots of publicity, the students did, for the racism that was going on in America. And a lot of white students, they made the civil rights movement stronger by joining it. They gave it legitimacy. They shocked the older generation. This was virtually the first time that young people, especially middle-class kids who, they have everything going for them, they opposed the government and they opposed their parents. And people were not really sure how to deal with that, to be quite honest with you. So that's the review of the student movement.